Our December meeting of the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission will please come to order. The staff has noted members in attendance, with Senator Norment being with us via phone. We have a busy docket for today and asked our Director, Hal Greer, to give us an overview as appropriate.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. I'll briefly overview today's agenda. After we honor Delegate Cox, we'll present the findings from our review of the juvenile justice system in Virginia, and then the findings from our affordable housing review. Then there'll be a report of the study topic selection subcommittee, and then finally we'll close the meeting with a brief VRS report. Mr. Chairman, at this time we'd like to recognize a distinguished and long-serving member of this commission who's retiring from legislative service. Delegate Kurt Cox joined this commission 21 years ago. He served as chair from 2008 to 2010. One of the most striking things about his service was the seriousness with which he took the work of this commission. While we don't have meeting attendance records that date back to the beginning of his service, I'm fairly sure that you could count on one or two fingers the number of meetings he missed in those 21 years. And while staff understand that it's not realistic for members of this commission to take the time to read all of our reports from cover to cover, given the demands on your time, Delegate Cox did. During presentations of our reports, Delegate Cox would often ask questions about statements that were deep in the reports. You probably didn't realize how much this meant to staff to know that you were investing this much time in their work, but it really meant a lot to them. And by the way, the questions that Delegate Cox asked were always exactly the right questions to be asked. Delegate Cox clearly recognized the importance of independent and objective legislative oversight and government accountability and the value of the role that JLARC played. Several years ago, when he was majority leader, he called me over to his office to talk about JLARC. He shared that he was concerned that the legislature was leaving worthwhile JLARC recommendations unimplemented, and he asked what could be done to address it. Born out of that meeting was a publication that we now present every November that lists all of the unimplemented recommendations. And 4 years ago, when Delegate Cox became Speaker, the staff assumed that he would step down from the commission, knowing all the other responsibilities that he would have to take on. But as you know, he instead decided to continue to serve on JLARC. What a affirmation of the importance of the work the commission does for him to have done so. And subsequently, his successor, Speaker Fillercorn, also decided to serve on the commission as Speaker. In closing, we're very fortunate in Virginia to have what I believe to be as strong a nonpartisan and independent legislative oversight function as any state in the country. And first and foremost, that is because the members of this commission and your predecessors have made the commitment to this function and strongly supported it. And in this commission's almost 50-year history, if any, individual members of the General Assembly have been more supportive or committed to the work of this commission or more responsible for the continued vitality of legislative oversight in Virginia than Delegate Cox. On behalf of the staff, I want to thank you for your commitment and support to our work over the years and wish you all the very best. And on behalf of the members of the commission, I would like to present a resolution that's signed by all the members in recognition of your exemplary service.
It'll be short. Hal, that was really nice. Way overdone, but what a privilege it's been for 21 years. We all sort of laugh. Let's be candid. We have our favorite commissions and things we think probably accomplish the most, and I can't think of a more important commission than JLARC. Thank you for your professionalism. You know, we want to do the right thing. You do such a good job of pointing out in your oversight capacity the things we need to improve on, but you know, one thing I don't think we recognize, some of the really good jobs we do within some of the agencies also, so it's a nice combination, but your staff is incredible. I won't start naming names, looking at some, but just I'm grateful to be a part of it, and the seriousness, Everybody says I look so relaxed now, so I'll try to be a little bit less serious in my retirement, so thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
Delegate Cox, I want to also add to the comments made by the staff that you will note that the resolution given to you is signed by the members of the commission, because we share that sentiment. We recognize that you've always been here. We recognize that you always ask good questions. We recognize that you take this work very seriously, and we recognize also that all of us have also a political role to play, but we set that role aside when we served on JLARC. And that's something we also want to commend you for being done over the years. So thank you very much for your good work, and we do recognize Godspeed for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, next on the agenda is a presentation from our view of the juvenile justice system in Virginia. 5 years ago, the Department of Juvenile Justice undertook a major reform of the system. Two of the primary goals of the transformation were to serve many more youth in the community rather than in secure confinement, and to serve youth closer to their homes. As you'll hear this morning, the department has had considerable success in achieving these goals and is serving many of the youth in the system in or near their communities. However, as you also hear this morning, there remain serious concerns and challenges regarding the current system that do need to be addressed. Among higher risk offenders, recidivism rates remain high and rehabilitative programs are not adequate. There also are significant fairness concerns. Youth in the system often don't have quality legal representation. Black youth are being referred to the system at higher rates than white youth. And youth committing offenses as minors must carry the records of many of those offenses for the rest of their lives. I want to thank Director Boykin and her staff at DJJ for their generous cooperation and assistance during this review. And with that, I'll turn it over to Justin Brown, who oversaw this study. Justin?
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Hal. Just real briefly, before I bring Drew up to start his presentation, I want to emphasize that we did a pretty comprehensive review of not just the Department of Juvenile Justice, but of the entire system around it. And so that system includes 24 locally owned and operated juvenile detention centers and part of the state's court system that adjudicates youth when they're referred to the system. So the detailed written report is well over 100 pages long, but in the interest of time this morning, we will not address all the topics in there. But if you notice something in the written report and would like to hear about it, just ask Drew, and I'm sure he'd be happy to kind of speak to that particular issue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have the project leader for this review, Drew Dickinson, come up and brief you on the report.
Members of the commission will follow our usual procedure. When the staff gives us an opportunity, we'll ask questions at those breaks. So tell us when, Drew.
All right, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. As Hal mentioned, my name is Drew Dickinson, and I was the project leader for our review of Virginia's juvenile justice system. The mandate for this study directed us to review various aspects of Virginia's juvenile justice system, and some of the items we were asked to review are listed on slide 2. The next slide summarizes our key research activities, which included 4 surveys and about 100 interviews. And more information about our study research methods can be found in Appendix B of our final report. Our study found that not all youth receive quality legal representation, and that Black youth are referred to the system at higher rates than white youth. Local and regional juvenile detention centers meet safety and security standards, but appear less than fully equipped to provide effective rehabilitative services. DJJ comprehensively assesses youth's risks and needs, but its rehabilitative programming appears unlikely to reduce reoffending. DJJ's reentry efforts have improved, though youth released from custody still lack fully adequate step-down supports. We also found that Virginia has substantial excess juvenile detention center capacity and that opportunities exist to more efficiently use these resources. I'd like to start off by giving you a little bit of high-level background on Virginia's juvenile justice system, and as well as some trends. The juvenile justice system is different than the adult criminal system because there is a greater focus on rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Statute lists the specific aims of the juvenile justice system, which include protecting public safety, as well as reducing the incidence of delinquent behavior in the future. The Department of Juvenile Justice, or DJJ, is the primary agency responsible for administering and overseeing juvenile justice services in Virginia. Through DJJ's 30 court service units, staff investigate complaints against youth, decide whether to charge youth for alleged offenses, and supervise youth on probation and parole. DJJ also operates the Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center and oversees 24 locally and regionally operated juvenile detention centers. Other federal, state, and local entities also play key roles in Virginia's juvenile justice system, some of which are listed on this slide. And about $248 million in state and federal funds were spent on juvenile justice services in Virginia in fiscal year 2020. And about 98% of this was state funded. The study resolution directed us to review the impacts of DJJ's recent reforms, and these reforms, which were initiated in 2016, were intended to reduce the number of youth in state correctional centers while maintaining public safety, increase local placement options and community-based programs, and to ensure that youth receive rehabilitative services to reduce the likelihood that they reoffend. Slide 11 shows how the number of youth in Virginia's juvenile justice system has steadily declined, which is similar to what we're seeing nationally. And a key driver appears to be declines in juvenile arrest rates, both in Virginia and nationally. However, some recent reforms by DJJ likely had some impact. Most youth in the juvenile justice system remain in the community, either on probation or on a diversion plan. In May of this year, 82% of youth in the juvenile justice system were in the community, while 18% were either at a juvenile detention center or at Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. And in recent years, rearrest rates among youth released from probation or diversion plans have declined. However, the COVID-19 pandemic makes it difficult to reach definitive conclusions about the sustainability of these declines. And I say this in part because we know that complaints referred to the juvenile justice system by law enforcement dropped by 41% between fiscal years 20 and 21. And this was by far the steepest decline year over year over the past decade. This reduction in law enforcement activity has likely contributed to the reduced proportion of youth who were rearrested after 2 years, after being released in 2018 or 19. In contrast, recidivism among youth released from secure facilities has remained high, and I'll get into some of the factors that may be contributing to this later on in the presentation. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here in case there are any questions from any members.
Have any questions? All right, sir, you move along.
All right. In the next section, I'll briefly summarize some of our key findings related to attorney representation for youth alleged to have committed delinquent acts. Let's see. All right. Youth have many of the same due process rights and constitutional protections as adults. These rights are particularly important for youth because they are less likely than adults to understand legal proceedings, advocate for their own best interests, or fully consider long-term consequences. State law requires that youth be appointed a qualified and competent attorney to represent them. And to adequately represent youth, attorneys need specialized knowledge, including knowledge of both juvenile law and adult criminal law, as well as community programming. Depending on family resources and availability of attorneys, youth may be represented by private attorneys, court-appointed attorneys, or in some localities, public defenders. We found that youth usually receive legal representation, but that some may not receive quality representation because of several factors, including low compensation and minimal training requirements for court-appointed attorneys. There's no quantifiable way to measure the adequacy of legal representation, but one of the most consistent things we heard throughout the study were concerns about the legal representation that some youth receive, especially when the attorney is court-appointed. Stakeholders we spoke to, including judges, Commonwealth's attorneys, and defense attorneys, reported a number of concerns, including that court-appointed attorneys in their jurisdictions often lack adequate knowledge to appropriately represent youth, and that many spend insufficient time on cases. You can see on the slide a couple of quotes, one from a judge and one from an attorney, that illustrates some of the concerns that we heard. One of the likely contributing factors to poor quality representation is that Virginia's maximum fee for court-appointed attorneys does not adequately compensate them for the amount of time needed to adequately represent juveniles. In Virginia, court-appointed attorneys for juveniles receive see. Oh, it's back on. All right. Sorry about that. So Virginia's maximum fee cap is the lowest in the nation and is substantially less than the median cap of $1,850 among states with similar caps. And another likely factor contributing to poor quality representation is insufficient training requirements for court-appointed attorneys. For example, under current requirements, court-appointed attorneys receive a combined 50 minutes of training on juvenile intake processes and detention hearings. We recommend increasing the maximum compensation for court-appointed attorneys in juvenile delinquency cases and strengthening the training requirements for court-appointed attorneys in juvenile delinquency cases. You can find more information about these issues and our recommendations in Chapter 3 of our report. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again in case there are any questions.
Any questions? Hearing none.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to now turn to our findings related to racial and regional disparities in the treatment of youth involved in the juvenile justice system. State law requires fair and appropriate treatment of youth in the juvenile justice system. Generally, youth who commit similar offenses should be treated similarly. There are a number of key decision points at which differences in the treatment of youth could occur, and we reviewed each of those decision points to see if there are any disparities by race as well as by region of the state. And based on the data available, we found that Black youth are more likely than white youth to be referred to the juvenile justice system. In Virginia, Black youth are about 2.5 times more likely than white youth to be referred to the juvenile justice system. The higher likelihood of Black youth being referred holds true for all types of offenses. Looking at data about where referrals from the juvenile justice system come from, we found that referrals from law enforcement contribute the most to overall disproportionality. About 2/3 of referrals came from law enforcement over the past decade, and Black youth were 2.6 times more likely to be referred by law enforcement than white youth. Schools also contribute to disproportionality, but to a lesser extent. Over the past decade, Black youth in Virginia were 1.7 times more likely to be referred by schools. And according to national research, the reasons for disproportionate referrals can be complex, and many factors, in addition to race and region of the state, may contribute to disproportionality. These factors can include law enforcement presence and practices, history of parental incarcerations, family income, and availability of community-based programs. However, additional training on implicit bias and cultural competency for law enforcement officers tailored specifically to working with juveniles would likely help. And several other states have made similar changes recently. A forthcoming review by DJJ on referrals by law enforcement and schools will likely help shed additional light on specific causes of disproportionate referrals, as well as opportunities to reduce disproportionality. Now, we also looked at decision points within the juvenile justice system and found that disparities exist, but are less substantial than referrals to the system. For example, the data indicate that when controlling for severity of offense, Black and white youth are generally equally likely to be petitioned by CSU staff. Also controlling for severity of offense, Black youth are somewhat more likely to be detained, adjudicated delinquent, or committed to DJJ by judges. Improving the quality of representation youth receive should help mitigate some of these disparities, but the report also has a number of additional options and recommendations that could help reduce disparities within the juvenile justice system. And slide 30 just summarizes some of our recommendations that we have in the report on this topic. We also found that youth who commit similar offenses are treated differently in different regions of Virginia. Some variation across the state is unavoidable, but general consistency in the treatment of youth for similar offenses is to be expected. Here's an example of the variation we saw in the treatment of youth across regions. It shows that youth in some court service unit districts were 8 times more likely to have their cases diverted than youth in other districts. Several factors appear to contribute to inconsistent treatment of youth across regions, including variation in community-based services available to intake officers and judges, variation in CSU policies, and variation in the judicial awareness of disposition options in their communities. In the report, we have some recommendations that should get at each of these root causes and promote greater consistency across regions. Mr. Chairman, again, I'll pause here in case there are any questions.
Questions? I may say those persons in the audience who are observing and those who are seeing us via live stream, the commission has received about a 100-page report. And what we're getting is a high overview of that report today. And that we will be exploring this more in depth as the individual committees take up recommendations that are here. So I don't want you to think that because we're not asking a bunch of questions, we're not aware of what what your study has found and what you're recommending. So just for that note. Go ahead. Yes, Senator Howell.
It seems to me that the most significant thing we've heard so far, and there's probably more to come, is that some areas you're 8 times more likely to be put in a facility, I guess is the best way to put it. That to me is really shocking because it shows the tremendously disparate way kids are treated in this Commonwealth. But this is an issue that I can remember going back at least 28 years in various aspects of the criminal justice system, including adults. A feeling that we should be responsive to the local community and not the state at all, as a whole. Have you all looked at that at all, or do you have an opinion?
So I think that is it's been a challenge. I think with the recommendations that we have in the report should help address those areas that we think we can address. For example, some of the policies that we could have a little bit more consistency on policies on diversion. There's some CSUs that just won't divert certain cases, while some that will consider it. And so we think that in terms of disparate treatment across regions, could help. Another one that actually, when we were talking to judges, they surprisingly were very excited about was just having an inventory of the disposition options that are available in their communities. So we have a recommendation in there that would have DJJ and CSUs help judges understand what options are available and maybe appropriate for youth other than, for example, putting them in a detention center or committing them to DJJ. So I think those could help. All right, and the next section I'll cover is on juvenile probation. Youth on probation remain in the community and are supervised by a probation officer working at a court service unit. Youth are required to comply with specific conditions while on probation and may be required to participate in certain community-based services. Recidivism among youth on probation has remained mostly stable over the past decade, but as I mentioned earlier, recent data indicates a slight decrease. We found that DJJ uses a nationally recognized community service supervision model for youth on probation, which is a good thing. However, not all youth respond to the model. We also found that more services are now available for youth on probation, though reviews of the quality of these services were only recently formalized by DJJ. DJJ uses a case management model called EPICS for youth on probation that is designed to address youth risk factors and reduce the likelihood that they reoffend. In response to our statewide survey, 91% of probation officers reported receiving good guidance and being held accountable for providing effective case management. Fewer probation officers felt their CSU provided EPICS in a manner that most youth are responsive to, which is important because youth responsivity is critical to the effectiveness of the EPICS model. And so we've identified some approaches, including those used by other states, that would help improve responsivity among youth on probation. And this next slide summarizes our recommendations related to improving youth responsivity. As I mentioned, youth may also be required to complete certain programs while they're on probation. And we found that youth on probation have access to more rehabilitative programs and services than before DJJ's reforms. We also note in the report that DJJ recently formalized a process to ensure that services for youth are high quality and staffed appropriately, and believe this is a very positive development. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again in case there are any questions. Next section of my presentation is on programs for youth at juvenile detention centers. As a reminder, these are locally and regionally operated facilities. I'll talk about the state's facility in the next section. There are 24 locally or regionally operated juvenile detention centers in Virginia. All 24 provide secure confinement for youth who are awaiting their hearings. 21 also provide longer-term rehabilitative programs for youth who have been adjudicated delinquent by a judge. About 70% of youth stay in detention centers for 30 days or less, and all youth receive educational programming, which is provided through VDOE. We found that Virginia's JDCs generally meet requirements and address health and safety problems in a timely manner. However, JDCs appear ill-equipped to provide effective rehabilitative programming. We also found that the educational programming at JDCs lacks adequate oversight, continuity, and vocational services. DJJ oversees JDC compliance with health, safety, security, and other requirements, and the most recent audit cycle found that JDCs were generally in compliance. One area of concern, however, is that about 68% of youth released from JDC rehabilitative programs are reconvicted within 2 years. This reconviction rate is higher than among youth released from the state's juvenile correctional center, which is a little surprising because youth in these programs are generally assessed to be at lower risk of reoffending than youth in the state's juvenile correctional center. Although reducing reoffending among high and moderate risk youth can be challenging, we found that more could likely be done to reduce these recidivism rates. For example, a majority of JDCs reported not having evidence-based programs designed to reduce recidivism. Only 5 JDCs reported using programs that are evidence-based and have been found to reduce the likelihood that youth released from secure facilities reoffend. The training requirements for JDC staff working with high-risk youth also appear to be insufficient. We have a few recommendations to improve the quality of rehabilitative programming for youth held at JDCs, and you'll find them in Chapter 6 of our report and summarized on this slide. Because these would be a substantial shift for some JDCs, we note that these changes should be phased in. And in terms of educational programming, we found that VDOE could do more to improve its oversight of the quality and outcomes of educational programs at JDCs. We also note that JDCs currently follow the traditional school year calendar of about 180 days, with a gap in educational programming in the summer. One JDC director noted during these times, youth can receive zero educational exposure. We believe an extended school year would be beneficial to youth in these facilities, and note that at least 18 other states provide an extended school year for youth in their juvenile detention centers. And we have a couple recommendations to get at these improvements that I just mentioned. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause again in case anyone has any questions. I'll now turn to our findings related to rehabilitative programs for youth in DJJ custody. After being committed to DJJ by a judge, youth in DJJ custody are generally placed at either Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center or at one of 9 community placement programs, which are juvenile detention centers. Most youth in DJJ have committed serious offenses. We found that the effectiveness of DJJ's core rehabilitative approach, the community treatment model, has not been verified and may be compromised by training, recruitment, and retention issues with key frontline DJJ staff. As part of its reforms, DJJ implemented a new approach to working with youth on a daily basis. The community treatment model is definitely an improvement over the correctional model previously used, but DJJ is facing some implementation challenges. The community treatment model relies heavily on having well-trained frontline staff known as residential specialists. We found that residential specialists were not receiving adequate or timely training that reflects their multifaceted role. DJJ is also experiencing substantial recruitment and retention issues for these critical positions, similar to what other public safety agencies are facing. We have a couple of recommendations to help address the training and staffing issues. And because the Department of Corrections and DJJ compete for staff, recent proposed salary increases for corrections officers would likely exacerbate DJJ's recruitment and retention issues. And for this reason, we note that if the General Assembly authorizes salary increases for corrections officers, it could also increase salaries for DJJ residential specialists. We also found that although no rehabilitative program can be fully effective for all youth, the current rehabilitative programming provided to DJJ for most youth appears unlikely to reduce reoffending. DJJ's rehabilitative approach has some, but not all, the elements necessary for it to be as effective as possible. For example, we found that DJJ does a good job assessing youth's risks and needs when they're taken into custody, but that youth's treatment progress is not adequately considered when deciding their length of stay. We also found that DJJ could likely offer more effective rehabilitative programming, as the 2 primary programs provided to the vast majority of youth in DJJ custody appear unlikely to reduce reoffending based on the best available national research. About 70% of youth completing at least one of these programs are reconvicted within 3 years. We also note in the report that DJJ collects good recidivism data, but is not currently integrated with treatment data to evaluate and improve services for youth. Reducing the likelihood that youth reoffend is challenging, but we have some recommendations that we feel could make sure that DJJ is maximizing its chances of having positive impacts on youth going forward. We also found that DJJ's community placement programs move youth closer to their home communities, but are not contributing to lower recidivism. As part of the recent reforms, DJJ began contracting with juvenile detention centers to provide secure treatment programs for youth in its custody. The goals of CPP programs are to reduce the use of juvenile correctional centers and to locate youth closer to home. CPPs have helped some youth stay closer to home, but their recidivism outcomes are worse. This is both surprising and concerning, because youth in CPPs are generally assessed to be at lower risk of reoffending than those at Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. And this slide shows you a comparison of recidivism rates between youth released from juvenile correctional centers and youth released from CPP programs at juvenile detention centers. DJJ formally started evaluating the quality of CPPs in 2018, and their on-site reviews appear to be useful. DJJ has also taken steps to address problems with community placement programs, including ending one contract with a juvenile detention center that was unable to meet program requirements. We believe these DJJ efforts are a positive development and that focused attention on the quality and effectiveness of CPP programming is warranted. We have a recommendation in the report that will help support more sustained attention to this issue. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause again in case there are any questions.
My question has to do with the community placement programs and the fact that you would think that moving kids closer to home would have more of an impact on recidivism, but apparently it's not. Could you go over your recommendations again with regard to that?
Sure, Senator Locke. It is best practice to keep youth close to their home communities as possible, and I think it's more about making sure that those juvenile detention centers are well-equipped, fully capable of supporting high-risk youth. I think some of our recommendations that we have, as are in Chapter 6, as well as in Chapter 7 of our report, should help. And this specific recommendation is to make sure that DJJ pays close attention to the quality of programming for youth in those communities, because just getting them closer to home is not enough. You need to make sure that they're supported, you're setting them up for success, and I think for longer term, that's the best thing for these youth, to be able to make sure they have as good a program as we can have in those centers.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask, following up on Senator Locke, are there any CPP programs that work better than others that can be used as an example? And is the private sector involved at all in providing these services?
So now with the CPP programs, there is variation in terms of the outcomes, and we can follow up with some more detail about that if that would be helpful. I would say that it's a little bit hard to compare because CPP programs can decide whether or not to take youth, and so some of them that take the harder risk youth, the ones that most challenging, may have worse outcomes. And so that's why, it's one of the reasons why we didn't lay it out there, because you need a lot of context in terms of the specific youth that they're teaching. But there are some juvenile detention centers that are using evidence-based programming, and you know, we visited one that was, you could tell the youth were like, they were really, they seemed like they were benefiting from the programs that were there, and we feel like that could be kind of more widely implemented.
Mr. Chairman? I think there's another way of looking at this, and I'm hearkening back to an experience I had during Governor McDonald's administration, when several of us were flown down to Texas to see what was going on with their Last Chance Ranch. And instead of putting the kids close to their communities, they actually took them out of their communities, put them in a totally foreign kind of an environment. I mean, there was nothing at this ranch but tumbleweeds. I mean, it was really in the middle of nowhere, a lot of snakes and stuff. And they were getting really good results. And part of what happened was, in some of the cases, the kids who got out of the ranch when their program was finished, they actually moved the whole family out of the environment they were in, because the thought was that was destructive of the kids. And I'm wondering, is any of that still going on? Is that still on the table as an option?
In Virginia, I'm not aware of anything like that, but nothing in Virginia. I'm not sure about Texas, but I definitely think that making sure that wherever the kids are, wherever these youth are, making sure that they're getting the best that we can do for them, just to make sure we're setting them up for success. And so it sounds like a really interesting approach, and I'm sure that there's different approaches we could take in terms that include that one.
Mr. Chairman.
I just, we may have some information at the office about other states. We think some of that may be going on. But the other thing I just wanted to say, this is a little bit of a corollary point, but when we went to the Bon Air facility and we talked to kids in small groups, and I will just say personally, I was struck. I asked some of the kids, do you want to go back to the community that you came from? And they said, that wouldn't be good for me to do that. So I do think this notion of maybe thinking a little bit more critically about where is the best place for these kids might have some value. Just to add that.
Delegate Herring.
Yeah, just, and I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer here, but it has to be said that, I mean, I don't know, and I was not privileged to go to Texas for that facility, but there is a difference between programs that help those who are dealing with substance abuse, and I don't know if that was a program or not, and programs with youthful offenders. And not all families have the resources to pick up and leave to go somewhere else. So we really have got to be mindful, and the evidence base where it talks about community, and there are reasons why children, and I'm not saying those, granted, some children don't want to go back to their community, but I just want us to be realistic that families don't have resources to pick up and move and go to a better place. Programs are different depending on what type, the focus of the program, because there's a wonderful program in Northern Virginia, but the youth offenders with felonies not necessarily accepted to that program. So we really have to be mindful about when we're looking and about changes that we need to make in our juvenile justice system, to look at what we can do to help children and the holistic approach instead of abandoning communities. So I'm very, very concerned about that if we're going to go down that path. It's a big concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, first kind of a statement. I'm not terribly surprised to see a relatively high recidivism rate just from my experience as a school teacher. I know kids who are acting up get punished, and if they're put back in the same crowd of kids, they tend to act up again. But that being said, was any part of the study looking at some of the individuals who did recommit crimes and any interviews with them as to what caused you? You know, was it because you'd gone back home and got back in with the same bad crowd? Or were there other factors? Because at the end of the day, I'm not sure we can develop much of a program until we talk to the kids and find out why you went back. You know, you got punished, that didn't work, so we're not going to solve the punishment problem to correct the problem until we understand why they're going back and doing the same bad deeds.
And so the national research points to peer influences as a big contributor to reoffending. And so actually, one of the things that you actually reminded me of is in the reentry section that I'll get to now. We actually have some commentary in there about actually doing some interviews with DJJ as part of their evaluations of the reentry programming, going and talking to the youth or figuring out what happened, what went wrong, and then seeing if we can't integrate that information to affect it. So if it was the treatment programs, that's one thing. If they truly, like as Justin mentioned, if the youth was just not set up for success, but going right back into where they were, where they came from, and some of the things that caused them to be there. I'm just learning that and integrating that into our treatment programming, and so they reminded me of that. So.
Maybe it's appropriate then that you go on and speak to the reentry program.
Sure, that sounds good. So the next section highlights our findings and recommendations related to reentry from DJJ custody. Nearly half of youth released from DJJ custody are reconvicted within the first 12 months of being released. And national research stresses the importance of planning for youth's reentry while youth are still in state custody, as well as facilitating youth's reentry back into the community. We found that DJJ's reentry efforts have improved in recent years, but that barriers to effective reentry remain. We note that educational programming and vocational opportunities appear to be helping to improve career readiness for youth at Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. And another positive finding is that family engagement among youth at Bon Air has improved in recent years. In our survey, youth reported much higher rates of family engagement than in 2015. Still, we found there are likely opportunities to improve the step-down supports for youth released from DJJ custody. Another barrier that can hinder successful reentry is that records of felony equivalent offenses for youth adjudicated delinquent in JNDR court cannot be expunged. And this is in contrast with recent changes to state law, which allows certain felony records for adults to be eligible for sealing. Virginia's approach here is also in contrast to all nearby states, which allow at least some juvenile felony equivalent records to be expunged or sealed. We have recommendations in Chapter 8 to improve step-down programming and to set up a process to allow certain less serious, nonviolent felony equivalent offenses to be eventually expunged. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause again in case there are any questions.
Why don't you go ahead and wrap up, and then we'll have questions.
All right. My last section this morning is on the number and locations of juvenile justice facilities in Virginia. And I'll first start off by talking about our findings related to funding and utilization of locally and regionally operated juvenile detention centers. As a bit of background, total estimated state support for JDCs was about $74 million in fiscal year 2020, and this represented about 1/3 of total JDC operational spending. The state pays the full share of costs of the educational programming at detention centers, and this totaled about $25 million in fiscal year 2020. We found that Virginia has substantial excess juvenile detention center capacity, and that continuing to maintain such levels of excess capacity is not an efficient use of limited state resources. We also found that Virginia's approach to educational programming in JDCs could likely be more efficient. In examining detention center facility needs, we reviewed utilization across all JDCs since 2006 and found that there's been a fairly persistent decline in the utilization across the state. As of fiscal year 2021, about 70% of JDC beds across the state were not being used, and very similar patterns exist in all regions of the state. The report notes that between 2006 and 2017, DJJ responded to declining utilization by closing 6 of its 7 juvenile correctional centers. Virginia's 24 JDCs have not responded similarly. We also looked at all of the juvenile detention centers in 9 nearby states and found that Virginia has the highest statewide detention center capacity at this time. These data points, as well as several others we mentioned in Chapter 9, suggest that there are opportunities to better align Virginia's detention center capacities with the need for these services. The report notes that consolidating or closing at least a few JDCs would likely reduce total state costs. Although more information would be needed, JLARC staff estimate that at least 3 JDCs within a 45-minute drive of other JDCs could be closed or consolidated. Savings would depend on several factors, but could range from $7 million to $14 million per year in state funds. I should note that it's important that the state does not have operational control over these facilities or own them, which makes closures and consolidations more difficult than it was with DJJ. Still, the General Assembly does have some options it could pursue to better align regional detention center capacities with the need for them. These include taking an approach similar to the regional jail funding model, which was successful in incentivizing the consolidation of small local jails. You could also start a process similar to the federal base realignment and closure process. And perhaps the biggest change, but the one that may make the most sense in the long term, would be to evaluate shifting away from the current structure and towards having specialized juvenile detention centers, either specializing in short-term detention or longer-term rehabilitative programming. And because educational funding comprises a substantial amount of state funding, we also looked at educational spending in juvenile detention centers. We found that many JDCs are not implementing potential efficiencies in education that could reduce costs, such as sharing staff with the school division, as some detention centers are doing, or using part-time instructional or administrative staff where possible. Although not all JDCs may be able to implement more efficient approaches to providing educational services, we believe further review is warranted. In Chapter 9, we have a recommendation that would have DOE work with DPB to determine the extent to which each juvenile detention center currently implements or could further implement cost-effective educational programming strategies. Mr. Chairman, the last finding I'll highlight is that the state's only remaining correctional center at Bon Air should be replaced with smaller facilities, but that the full needs are currently unclear. Most stakeholders agree that Bon Air does not meet the needs of youth committed to DJJ. It is among the largest secure facilities in the region and nationally, and was not designed to support rehabilitative programming. Having a single facility can also make it challenging for families to visit from some areas. DJJ has twice attempted to site a new, smaller facility in the eastern region, but both of these efforts were unsuccessful. DJJ already has preliminary approval to build a new secure facility, and we recommend that DJJ move forward with building a smaller juvenile treatment facility on the Bon Air campus, while the locations of the other facilities are being determined. Slide 84 just summarizes our key findings, and in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, I won't read through them again.
Delegate Torrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the consolidation or closing of DJC. The question that I have for you, bullet number 3, you said that the state does not directly control or fully fund JDCs and therefore does not have control over the closure of facilities. Who makes those decisions then? If it's not the state, who makes those?
So the state does fund part of the operations, but they are locally or regionally operated. So like Fairfax has its own juvenile detention center, but there is a Blue Ridge juvenile detention center that's operated by a commission of representatives from localities, so that they would make the decision.
So the localities make the decision?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Short answer to the question.
Delegate O'Rourke.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, may. I think we would all agree that most of these kids would benefit most in educational programs that are career and technical focused. They tend to be much more hands-on oriented and less academically. And the challenge that brings is that's also the most costly on the part of the system to provide the facilities necessary for them, the shop facilities, things of that nature. Did you identify any impediments to creating a collaborative agreement between the juvenile correction system and local school divisions for using their career and technical facilities in the evenings or other otherwise student population use times?
But that's a really interesting idea, and we have a recommendation in the report. It's in Chapter 6 that would have VDOE pay closer attention to the vocational opportunities currently available to youth, because that was one of the things that we heard most commonly was needed, was more attention to those, better programming, and that's a really interesting idea.
And Mr. Chairman, follow up to that, if, as y'all are ruminating over this, if you have ideas of things that could help to facilitate this, and or if you identify anything that's acting as an impediment to these types of programs, because to me it only kind of makes sense. Everybody can be in a win-win, because if these kids, once they're discharged from JCC, end up back in the public schools and create problems again, you know, we need to find some solutions within our existing resource network, and I think that may be part of an answer.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I just asked the rest of the team. We didn't hear anything to your point in terms of specific barriers. So if we go back and look and are reminded of anything, we'll let you know. But I think part of it may just be the inertia around doing things kind of a certain way. But that's just a guess.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Delegate Herring.
Just a couple of comments and just observations, if you don't mind. One of the things I noticed at the beginning of this study report is that we have the last report, the last meeting, talking about guardians and conservatorships. So I think there's clearly an issue with attorney training. Being an attorney myself, I feel in a safe space to say this, that we have sort of a consistent finding that attorneys are not properly trained and educated in the field that they're practicing. And so that's in terms of continuing legal education that has to happen, that we're required to do. So that's just something I see consistent when we're dealing with our adults who are incapacitated when we're dealing with our juveniles. The second is compensation, and I know that there have been budget requests in the past to increase a court-appointed attorneys and their compensation is something that, I mean, I've heard consistently a lot during this past year about the problem that causes. And just, Mr. Chair, just one last comment and just a concern, just a flag. If the legislature does consolidate and goes down that path of consolidating 45-minute drive. There are 45 minutes, currently the facilities, 3 are within a 45-minute drive of each other. So just if somebody does want to consolidate, I throw this out there that there is concern from me, doesn't matter, it's not me, I'm sure there are others. Not everyone has a car, and so transportation to go see your child, and also mental development of child, a separation at a certain age is different for a 14-year-old versus a 17-year-old. And that's just a reality. So I just hope that those factors are considered if someone decides to look at consolidation. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? We have Valerie Boykin, the director of DJJ, I think is to make comments also. Ms. Boykin? Ms. Boykin, I want to first of all thank you for your cooperation with the staff in putting together this report. And thank you also for the dedication that you show in taking on what's a tough task. And while there are many recommendations about what we might do in the future, I know you've been putting forth your best effort, but how do you respond to the reports before you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address you regarding the findings of the JLARC study of the juvenile justice system in Virginia. On behalf of DJJ, I want to thank Director Hal Greer, Justin Brown, and Drew Dickerson and the entire team for their hard work and diligence in putting together this report, which should undoubtedly lead to an improved juvenile justice system for all Virginians. The tasks they had included a complex array of systems that comprise the juvenile justice system in Virginia. So often, DJJ is looked at as running the whole thing, and I think this report will clarify for many that we don't. For instance, we only provide via the code and regulatory oversight of the detention centers by doing a 3-year certification. We do contract with those that run the CPP programs, and we take that very seriously and have quality assurance in there trying to look at the program to improve those, but we don't run the entire system. So we appreciate the efforts to help educate all of us and know that many people contribute to juvenile justice in Virginia. The study team was asked to look at a number of those components and make recommendations for improvement. Many of the recommendations they made about DJJ's work, we actually agree with. And many of them, we already have things underway to look at those particular efforts and suggestions. As you may know, we embarked on a major transformation initiative and submitted a plan to the General Assembly in 2016. We've accomplished a lot since that time, and our annual updates to your body reflect much of that, but our work is still underway. Much of this report goes back 10 years, and some of those early findings were things that led to the initial transformation work under DJJ's efforts in our initial plan. We're proud of the progress that we've made to turn our system from one that was focused largely on punishment to one that provides a more balanced approach and focuses on rehabilitation and accountability, but never losing sight of public safety as one of our paramount concerns. To highlight a few things that we've done, we now do a much more thorough job of assessing the risk and needs of youth that come into the system. We try to treat, as you've heard today, youth closer to home or in their communities when possible. And to that end, we now have, when we started planning for transformation, we had 600 kids in state care. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have under 200. We have leveled somewhat the playing field with adding more resources and services across the Commonwealth than ever before, including many family-based services. I appreciated the conversation about what happens with families and neighborhoods and communities. And so we believe that children are not in isolation. They live in these communities, these neighborhoods, and these families, many of whom all need services, resources, and supports. And so one of our major initiatives on the transformation was to build a system of family-based care. And that system's been looked at by our own social services as we've stood up multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy in 129 of Virginia's 133 cities and counties. We are proud of that work. We continue to work and invest the dollars you allowed us to keep by closing those 6 facilities in community-based services. Have we figured it all out, ladies and gentlemen? No, we have not. But we're proud of that broader array of services. As I said, our work is not done. We are a lot different than we were 5 years ago, but we know we're still in the early stages of change. I sometimes get a little impatient, and as I talk to my colleagues around the country, they say it takes years. They say, be patient, stay the course. A lot of folks look at the Missouri system, and it's been touted as one of the best, though it's maybe not on all the evidence-based list. But even 20 years in, their former director said, look, we're still growing, we're still improving. I talked to my colleague in Massachusetts, and they've lifted up a lot of new services. And they say, be patient and stay the course. We're trying to do that. We had said that when we started transformation, and I should say that I was previously the Deputy Director for Community-Based Programs before becoming the director in 2019. And we knew that it would take a few years before some of the young people getting those initial services, we could even look at their outcomes. So we thought 2018, fiscal 2018, might be the first year that we could look at outcomes. And in my conversations with JLARC, we thought 2 years out, that's fiscal 2020, and that last quarter is when COVID hit. But we started seeing some trending down, and we're really pleased with that, but it's still a little early to see just how much of a difference it's making. With that said, the unexpected and unintended challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 21 months have created such a new reality for us and for all of the world. But it's interrupted a lot of our agency plans and our focus. It hit less than a year after I became the director. And so we had to shift to survival mode. How do we protect young people, their families, and their staff as we go about doing the day-to-day work that we're expected to do? And I say to some, we kind of had to shift to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and those basic needs of life, health, and safety, just to make sure we could continue on. That said, as I became director when Andy Block stepped down in 2019, my executive team and I decided that we would chart a course to continue the path forward, but a bit more methodically. And if I could share a little bit about our journey, in those early days of transformation, we talked about building this plane as we flew it, trying to figure out how to make change and make it rapidly and all of that. And so one of the things the staff said is, this is too much, too fast. Help us to grasp it. So we tried to slow things down just a little bit. And if I could use another transportation analogy, I tried to shift to, we're now going to use a locomotive and move a little slower and pick up and learn new tasks, new skills, and figure out where we are and analyze what's working, analyze what we need to do a little better job with, and continue to move forward. And so as the conductor, and as we continue to learn and grow, I look at this JLARC study as just another opportunity for us to make a station stop, get some outside recommendations that will help us to grow and learn and move our system forward. We've gotten a lot of attention nationally on some of the innovations we've done, and we're appreciative of that. We also received the L. Douglas Wilder Award for Innovations in Government earlier this year. We're proud of that, but we know our work is not done, and so we will learn and grow from this, and we stand ready to partner with the other aspects of the system as we take a deeper dive into the recommendations and figure out how to move forward. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you today, and look forward to continuing to review this long study and move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the Commission.
Of Director Boykin. We thank you very much, ma'am, and thank you for your hard work and your cooperation.
Thank you.
We do not normally open up these meetings for public comment, but Senator Marsden, who's kind of an expert in the subject, I promised that I'd give him 2 minutes.
All right.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Senator Dave Marsden. I chair the Commission on Youth here in the Commonwealth. And we did a major study, Amy Atkinson and her staff did a major study of the detention education programming in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And just, I've got some information that we can hand out here to everyone, just to a few highlights of that study. We're down to 1 teacher per 2.9 children. And you know, 51% of the children in juvenile detention are there less than 10 days, which means about 5.5 days of school. So, you know, what has happened is the numbers of kids have come down, but the resources that we've placed into education and general support for juvenile detention centers has not declined. We are, Mr. Chairman, one thing Valerie brought up that's really great news. In 1997, I think we had about 1,500 children in our Department of Juvenile Justice commitment facilities. I think there were 7 or 8 of them at the time. We had 1,425 children in our juvenile detention centers. Today, we're around 700, not 3,000. So this is good news, but it comes with problems that we have in that the youth who are in our treatment programs, our commitment programs, are much more serious. The most important thing we have done in juvenile justice here in the Commonwealth is that we no longer try to teach kids lessons by putting them in detention. It just doesn't work. We only put kids in detention now if they're a risk to public safety. And that has kept kids from recidivating at that level of the system. However, it is still a problem, as it's been reported, you know, in our commitment and our CPP programs. But what's happened here is the resources that we're putting into this are just enormous. We have 1 detention facility in the Commonwealth where an occupied bed, they average about 6 kids at a time, is $639,000 per bed per year. The average is about $199,000 step-wide. My old program, the Fairfax County Juvenile Detention Center, 121 beds. For the last few months, they've been averaging 20 kids. We have 13 education positions. What you will find in your folder is that I am taking before the Commission on Youth on Wednesday a study resolution to look at the funding of juvenile detention centers, the potential for consolidation. I've dealt with Justin Brown and his staff closely throughout this process. We've had 4 or 5 conversations around this, but we do need to take a look at potential for consolidation, reducing costs, and reinvesting the savings into solving the kind of problems that JLARC has put forth here, so that we reinvest in our juvenile detention center, because we're just overly invested in juvenile detention and in juvenile detention education, and we can put this on a more level playing field, and we'll have other options to moving forward. Mr. Chairman, what you'll find in your folder is also a spreadsheet with all the data on the costs currently going on.
And Senator Morrison, thank you for your decades of work in this whole area and for your contributions over time. And it sounds like what you're going to be doing on Wednesday is going to be very compatible with what we've been talking about here. So thank you for bringing us up to date on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll add one thing, that potential closures could open up opportunities for the very smaller facilities that we need, and that gives us some potential. We just need to study it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the next item on the agenda is our review of affordable housing in Virginia. As you'll hear this morning, the state has substantial unmet need for affordable housing, and as a result, many Virginians are financially burdened by the cost of their housing. Virginia Housing is the state entity that plays the most significant role in helping to provide affordable housing in Virginia, and through their various programs, they have accomplished a lot in making housing more affordable in the state. However, you'll also hear this morning that given their substantial financial strength and resources, they can and should be doing more to address affordable housing in the Commonwealth. You'll also hear this morning that restrictive locality zoning is a significant impediment to the development of affordable housing, and the report offers some options to try to address this difficult challenge. I want to thank Susan Dewey and her staff at Virginia Housing for their cooperation and assistance throughout this study. And I want to thank Eric Johnston and his staff at DHCD for their cooperation and assistance as well. I'll now turn it over to Tracy Smith, who oversaw the study. Tracy?
Thank you, Hal. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members.
Thank you.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce a guest here with our staff, and that's David Jones from CSG Advisors, who worked with our affordable housing team very closely on this study. We hired CSG to examine a program managed by Virginia Housing and funded by the authority's net income. It's called the REACH program, and we'll talk about CSG's analysis and their findings in the presentation this morning. I have to say it's been extremely rewarding professionally to work with David and the other experts at CSG, and we're very grateful for their commitment to JLARC's work and to their professionalism. Finally, Mr. Chairman, before I turn it over to our project leader, Stephanie Papps, I just wanted to remind you all that in May you approved a second phase of this project that will specifically focus on the operations, performance, and oversight of Virginia Housing. Because Virginia Housing is an independent state government authority, doesn't receive state general funds, its operations and performance are less visible to you all in the General Assembly. And so in June, we'll report on the authority's operations, performance, and oversight. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Papps, who led our study of affordable housing, and she'll share with you her team's findings and recommendations.
Thank you. Stephanie, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. My name is Stephanie Papps, and I was the project leader for our review of affordable housing. I'd like to thank Ellie Rigsby and Sam Leisman, who also worked on the study with me. The mandate for this study directed us to review various aspects of Virginia's affordable housing needs and efforts to address those needs. This slide lists the research tasks that our team completed. We did a number of analyses on Census Bureau and agency program data, conducted over 100 interviews, reviewed academic and practitioner literature, and attended multiple stakeholder meetings. We also surveyed local Virginia planning departments on their zoning and land use. Finally, we contracted with a national expert on housing finance to review Virginia Housing's financial status and strength and its ability to allocate funds towards affordable housing. A full description of our team's methods are included in Appendix B of the final report. This slide shows the main findings from our report. We found that nearly 30% of Virginia households are cost burdened. Virginia has a shortage of at least 200,000 affordable rental units, mostly in the urban crescent, but also in rural areas. Virginia Housing could contribute more to the state's largest source of discretionary affordable housing funds, do more to increase the inventory of rental housing, and improve assistance to homebuyers with upfront mortgage costs. And finally, we found that not enough land is zoned to allow or encourage development of affordable housing, particularly in fast-growing localities. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to start off by giving you some high-level background on affordable housing in Virginia. Housing access and stability can have serious impacts on individuals' health, education, and economic outcomes. Housing affordability is an important aspect of housing stability. Households are considered cost burden when they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Throughout this presentation, I'll use the term cost burden to refer to households who are in housing that they can't afford. The proportion of households that are cost burdened is a measure of the availability of affordable housing in the state. A subset of cost burdened households are severely cost burdened. These households are spending more than half of their income on housing. Two state entities administer housing programs in Virginia. The first is the Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD. DHCD is the lead state agency for housing programs, administering a variety of housing block grants. Additionally, since June 2020, DHCD has administered the Virginia Rent Relief Program. As of October 2021, DHCD had dispersed $506 million in assistance to over 60,000 households. Virginia has been recognized as a national leader in getting pandemic-related rental assistance funds out to households that need it. In addition to administering these federal programs, DHCD also administers the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. The trust fund is one of two different discretionary fund sources that the state has to address the state's housing needs that's not subject to federal allocations, rules, or regulations. DHCD uses up to 20% of the trust fund to provide services to households experiencing homelessness, and it uses the rest of the funds to finance affordable housing development. These funds can be used to finance the construction or rehabilitation of new affordable rental or for-sale housing. In fiscal year 21, DHCD awarded $24 million to produce over 2,800 affordable housing units. Virginia Housing, also known as the Virginia Housing Development Authority, is the other state entity involved in housing programs. While DHCD is a state agency, Virginia Housing is an independent state authority that acts as a bank for funding affordable housing. Virginia Housing provides financing for multifamily rental developments and single-family home loans. Over the past fiscal year, Virginia Housing provided $2.2 billion in financing. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here if there are any questions. Next, I'll summarize our findings around Virginia's affordable housing needs. In the interest of time today, I won't cover all of the findings and recommendations in our report, but will instead summarize some of our most important ones. We found that nearly 30% of Virginians can't afford their housing and would be considered cost-burdened. Slide 12 shows the breakdown of Virginia households by cost burden. Almost 30% of Virginia's 3.2 million households are cost-burdened. Of those households that are cost-burdened, nearly half of them are severely cost-burdened, meaning that they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Individuals who work in many common occupations earn low salaries or wages, and this makes them more likely to be cost-burdened. For example, the annualized income for a home health aide would be considered very low income, while the annualized income for a bus driver would be considered low income. However, for many occupations where individuals work on an hourly basis, such as cashiers, waiters, or home health aides, if they're unable to find full-time work or to work full-time, their hourly wages would likely fall in the extremely low income category. Around 65% of Virginia households own their home. Compared to households who rent their homes, owning households are less likely to be cost-burdened. Across all households who own their home, 21% are cost-burdened compared to 44% of renters. Our next finding is that Virginia has a shortage of housing that's available and affordable for lower income households. Turning first to rental housing, at least part of the reason why renters are more likely to be cost-burdened than owners is because Virginia, like most of the nation, has a shortage of affordable rental units for households with extremely and very low incomes. When households can't find a rental unit that's affordable to them, they may end up renting a unit where they spend a large portion of their income on housing. The state has a shortage of at least 200,000 affordable rental units, and every region of the state needs additional affordable rental units. Our analysis showed a shortage of rental units at all income levels, but the shortage is most severe for extremely and very low income households. Additionally, this analysis considered quality issues that may be affecting rental units in a limited way. All areas of the state, but rural areas especially, may have a larger need of affordable rental units than these estimates describe due to quality issues in the existing inventory. Slide 17 shows the 10 localities in need of the most affordable rental units. These 10 localities are all fast-growing localities with an average population growth of 10%. Turning then to for-sale housing. Home prices in Virginia have risen significantly. Since 2016, home prices statewide increased by 32%, and most of that increase happened in the past year alone. Between 2020 and 2021, home prices increased by 15%. As a result of the rapid rise in home prices, fewer Virginia renters are even able to afford to buy a home. In 2016, approximately 28% of renters could afford to buy a home. By 2021, only 19% of renters could afford to buy a home. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause again to see if there are any questions. I'd like to turn now to our findings related to available resources to address the state's affordable housing needs. As we briefly identified for you all, Virginia has substantial unmet affordable housing needs. Chapter 3 of the report provides a discussion of how these needs could potentially translate into dollars, and the cost could be significant if the state chose to fully address all of these needs. Addressing Virginia's housing needs will require an investment of time and money, and it should be guided by a prioritized and strategic plan. Virginia has two main sources of funds that are discretionary, meaning that they're not subject to federal rules and regulations around how they can be used. The first of these fund sources is the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. As you all know, this source of funding is appropriated by the General Assembly from state general funds, and funds have been appropriated since 2014. The second of these fund sources is the REACH Fund. Annual amounts are allocated to REACH by the Virginia Housing Board of Commissioners, and those allocations are based on the authority's financial performance. These funds are administered by Virginia Housing and are used for three broad categories of projects: expanding home ownership, developing additional affordable rental housing, and providing community outreach. Historically, the amounts available through REACH have been far larger than the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. Fiscal year 21 marked the largest ever appropriation to the trust fund of $71 million, but the REACH allocation still exceeded it. As you can see, the amounts allocated to REACH have increased significantly over the time period shown. This is because Virginia Housing has increased the percentage of its net income that it contributes to REACH several times in the time period, from 15% in 2014 to an effective rate of 70% in 2022. As we discussed earlier, Virginia has a large need for affordable housing, and addressing those needs could be costly. Because Virginia Housing's purpose is to finance affordable housing and address the state's housing needs, our team reviewed whether Virginia Housing was maximizing the amount of funds that it contributes to affordable housing through its REACH program. To conduct this work, we contracted with CSG Advisors, a national expert on housing finance that has done financial reviews and analyses for many other state housing finance agencies. CSG conducted a structured financial review and developed a forecast model to determine whether Virginia Housing could contribute additional funds to REACH in the future. CSG found that Virginia Housing could afford to contribute more to the REACH program. Virginia Housing bases its annual REACH contributions on a percentage of net income it's earned on average over the past 5 years. Currently, it has the contribution percentage set at 60% of net income. The formula counts REACH grants made in a particular year as an expense in calculating its future REACH allocations. By counting grants as an expense in the formula, Virginia Housing is basing its annual REACH commitment on a lower total amount than if REACH grants were not counted as an expense in the formula. Between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 31, CSG projects that the proposed formula would yield $230 million more for affordable housing than the currently used formula. In addition to finding that Virginia Housing could change how they calculate REACH contributions, CSG also found that Virginia Housing could afford to contribute a higher percentage of their net income to REACH. Virginia Housing could contribute 75% of its net income to REACH without negatively impacting their financial strength. Doing so would result in an additional $102 million for REACH by fiscal year 31. This slide just shows the two recommendations regarding adjusting the REACH formula. In terms of planning, we found that Virginia doesn't consistently assess or plan for statewide housing needs. Virginia's approach to identifying and planning for housing needs across the Commonwealth is decentralized and reliant on local governments. Virginia localities are required to create comprehensive plans that must include a section on affordable housing, and some localities and regions have done more extensive assessments than that. Several other states, however, conduct comprehensive statewide housing needs assessments on a regular basis that consider what and where the state's most pressing housing needs are. Some states are also beginning to develop statewide housing plans that go a step beyond what a needs assessment does. These plans outline specific strategies the state plans to use to address housing needs, and in at least one case contain specific, measurable goals the state planned to pursue. The report makes two recommendations in this area. First, DHCD should conduct a statewide housing needs assessment every 5 years. And second, DHCD should develop a statewide housing plan that details strategies the state will use to address its housing needs. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again for any questions.
Mr.
Yes, sir. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question on the increasing the percentage up to 75% in order to yield some additional capacity. On page 25, it's indicated at roughly 102 million of potential, but there's some other tables in the report that indicate up to 300 million, depending on the steps and grants. Can you explain the delta between those two numbers?
Yeah, that's correct. So the first step of changing the formula so that the grants are not counted as expenses would yield the 230 million additional for affordable housing. And then the second step of increasing the contribution rate to 75% would result in 102 million. So adding the two together gets to 300 some million.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Next, we reviewed some of the larger programs that the state administers to increase the supply of affordable rental housing. DHCD and Virginia Housing both administer programs that provide financing for affordable housing, but Virginia Housing programs are much larger. Virginia Housing has administered over $4 billion in financing since 2013, and their financing makes up 60% of a development's total financing on average. Because Virginia Housing programs are much larger, financing more projects and units, our findings throughout this section will focus on their programs. Constructing affordable rental housing typically requires financial assistance for developers, and this slide shows the three main ways in which Virginia Housing provides assistance: bond financing, LIHTC, and REACH subsidies. Each one of these financing sources comes with different affordability requirements, and these sources can be used in different combinations. First, we wanted to discuss Virginia Housing's workforce housing program. We found that rental units in the workforce housing program developments that are reserved for lower income tenants are not affordable to all lower income tenants for whom units are reserved. However, workforce housing developments are eligible for REACH funds, which subsidizes them. Since 2017, Virginia Housing has substantially increased its financing of workforce housing developments, which are sometimes referred to as mixed-use, mixed-income, or economically mixed developments. Between 2013 and 2017, Virginia Housing administered an average of $150 million in taxable bond financing. That yearly average has doubled to $300 million in the past few years. That increase was driven almost exclusively by workforce housing developments. The workforce housing program requires developers to reserve a certain number of units for households with lower incomes, typically 20% of units for households that earn 80% or less of the area median income. This type of requirement is called an income restriction. However, the program does not require developers to restrict the rents on those units. In other words, developers can charge the same rents for all units in the development, regardless of whether tenants comprise the 20% of lower income households. Other affordability programs, such as LIHTC, require rent restrictions in addition to income restrictions to ensure that units are affordable to lower income tenants. We found that workforce housing income-restricted units had only slightly lower average rents than the units in the same developments that were not reserved for lower income households. We also found that the median cost burden of residents living in these income-restricted units was the same as the statewide median for renters at the same income level, meaning that income restrictions associated with workforce housing programs didn't make the housing more affordable for residents. Rent restricting units that are income restricted in workforce housing developments would help these households afford their housing. As a result, the report recommends that incomes and rents in a portion of workforce housing developments be restricted, and that Virginia Housing increase the amount of REACH subsidy available to these developments. Next, we found that Virginia Housing doesn't maximize tax-exempt private activity bonds or the REACH program to increase the inventory of affordable rental units. Private activity bonds are federally regulated tax-exempt bonds issued by state and local governments to finance multifamily housing development. Developments that are at least 50% financed with private activity bonds automatically receive 4% LIHTC credits. Virginia Housing doesn't use its entire private activity bond cap for multifamily development financing. Instead, it converts leftover bond cap to mortgage credit certificates, which reduce single-family mortgage holders' federal tax liability. Using bond cap for mortgage credit certificates doesn't draw down any additional federal funding. The amount of private activity bonds Virginia uses for multifamily development each year is driven by developer demand. Developers and stakeholders told JLARC staff that more projects may be feasible if additional gap funding were available. Virginia Housing could use REACH funds to provide additional funding for projects that have a gap in their financing, but could otherwise use tax-exempt bonds and 4% LIHTC credits. Since 2016, Virginia Housing has not fully utilized the amount of REACH funds it allocated for rental development subsidies. Virginia Housing could use these funds to provide an additional funding source for projects that have this funding gap. The report recommends that Virginia Housing use REACH funds to offer gap financing to projects using tax-exempt bonds and 4% LIHTC credits, and that it report annually to its board on these projects and the units created. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again for any questions.
Any questions of our presenter? Hearing none, go ahead.
All right. As we discussed earlier, home prices have been increasing, and options may be needed to address these rising home prices. The report contains a discussion of some emerging options that could be used to help expand the inventory of for-sale housing available for low and middle-income Virginians. In today's presentation, though, I'll focus on our findings around Virginia Housing's single-family mortgage and down payment assistance programs. State law requires Virginia Housing to lend to low and middle-income Virginians who would have trouble accessing a mortgage in the commercial market. We found that, consistent with state law, Virginia Housing effectively helps low and middle-income Virginians qualify for and afford a mortgage. We also found that Virginia Housing effectively prevents foreclosure against its borrowers. Low and middle-income households can have difficulty qualifying for a commercial mortgage because mortgage lenders may view them as being riskier investments. Virginia Housing appears to serve those Virginians that would face difficulty securing a commercial mortgage by serving borrowers with lower incomes, higher loan-to-value ratios, higher debt-to-income ratios, and lower credit scores than borrowers in the commercial market. Virginia Housing borrowers are also much more likely to be first-time homebuyers. Virginia Housing borrowers do have a higher delinquency rate, though, than the national average. However, Virginia Housing's foreclosure rate is lower than the state and national average. This means that Virginia Housing is able to work with their borrowers to resolve delinquencies before they result in a foreclosure. Virginia Housing staff credit this low foreclosure rate to the fact that they service all of their own loans and do extensive outreach to their borrowers. State law requires Virginia Housing to establish interest rates as low as possible, but we found that for some Virginia Housing mortgage types, Virginia Housing's interest rates are just slightly higher than the rates offered through the commercial market. We compared the interest rates on Virginia Housing mortgages from 2018 to 2020 to those offered through other Virginia commercial lenders in that same time frame. We controlled for factors like type of loan, demographic characteristics, income, debt-to-income ratio, and loan-to-value ratio. We found that for 3 types of Virginia Housing mortgages, the interest rates for Virginia Housing were slightly higher than the rates through the commercial market. Generally, these differences amounted to about $20 to $30 extra on a monthly mortgage payment. Virginia Housing offers down payment assistance in 2 different forms, through a grant and through a second mortgage called a plus mortgage. In a few slides, I'll provide more information about the differences between these 2 types of down payment assistance. When a borrower takes a plus second mortgage, Virginia Housing adjusts the borrower's interest rate up for both the primary mortgage and the plus mortgage. This interest rate adjustment policy is likely driving most of the differences we observed in Virginia Housing's mortgage rates and the commercial rates. The report makes a few recommendations in this area intended to ensure that Virginia Housing's mortgage interest rates are as low as possible, consistent with state law, and to add some transparency around what Virginia Housing's mortgage interest rates are and how they compare to the commercial market. In addition, Virginia Housing's borrowers are low and middle income households who can have relatively high cost burdens. Offering lower interest rates than the commercial market could provide an additional benefit to these borrowers, but it would come at the cost of reduced funds available for REACH. The report recommends that the General Assembly direct Virginia Housing to conduct a financial analysis to determine whether it could offer lower interest rates than the commercial market. We found that PLUS mortgages can cover more upfront costs for home buyers than the down payment assistance grant, but the PLUS mortgage can increase borrowers' debt. Down payments and closing costs can present the most significant barrier to home ownership because buyers are typically required to pay at least 5% of the sales price in cash between the down payment and closing costs. Many low and middle income buyers may not have enough cash available to do this. Virginia Housing Plus second mortgages can cover most of the upfront costs for a buyer, but they require repayment. Virginia Housing also offers a grant to cover down payment costs for some of their lower income borrowers, but the grant program doesn't fully cover the upfront costs. To address this, Virginia Housing could replace the current down payment assistance program with a program to better reduce costs for borrowers. This new program could either be a larger grant or a 0% interest deferred second mortgage. Both of these options would offer considerable savings to borrowers. Providing greater assistance to lower income borrowers would impact REACH. However, over the next 5 to 10 years, we estimate that the impact would be less than 2%. This slide describes the recommendation that Virginia Housing replace their down payment assistance program with a new program that provides greater assistance to lower income borrowers. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again for any questions.
Any questions so far? Hearing none, you can finish up.
All right. Next, I'd like to talk about the impact of local zoning and land use policies on affordable housing supply. The study resolution specifically directed JLARC staff to research local zoning practices to evaluate the extent to which they constrain housing supply. Local zoning ordinances determine where, how much, and what type of housing can be built in a community. Nationally and in Virginia, most localities have ordinances that do three main things. First, zoning designates what can and cannot be built. For example, certain zones may only allow single-family homes to be built in them, while other zones may allow single-family and multifamily homes to be built. Second, zoning sets standards and limits for construction by type and zone. For example, a zone may only allow buildings up to a certain height or require that lot sizes for homes be a minimum size. And finally, zoning defines the process by which local governments approve development. As a result of these standards that zoning sets, zoning can impact housing costs and availability. We found that existing zoning ordinances can constrain the development of new affordable housing, especially in Virginia's fastest growing localities. One reason that zoning can make it difficult for developers to respond to housing demand is that rezoning increases the cost and risks of developments. Rezoning is the process by which localities make adjustments to their existing zoning ordinance to allow a type of development that wasn't previously permitted. Developments that comply with existing zoning ordinances are called by right developments. Developers can apply for rezoning if they wish to construct a development not allowed by right, but rezoning can cost a developer between $250,000 and $1 million. Developers may lose that investment if the rezoning application is not approved. Housing developers, local planners, and national and statewide experts told JLARC staff that restrictive zoning constrains housing development. JLARC staff surveyed local planning departments in all localities about housing market conditions and zoning. Localities representing 80% of the state's population responded, and the vast majority of respondents said that their zoning ordinances don't currently allow for enough by right development to meet their housing needs. The local zoning survey also asked local planners to select the top 5 constraints to housing development in their locality. 30% of localities that responded to the survey reported that zoning was a top factor constraining housing supply. These localities were largely high-cost localities with high population growth that are clustered along I-95 or were localities with colleges or universities located there. Localities that reported zoning as a top constraint to housing development had higher population growth, home prices, and rents than other localities. This finding follows the logic that localities with growing populations are more likely to need new and denser development than other localities. Even though most localities did not report that zoning was a top constraint to housing development, nearly 80% of localities reported that a quarter or less of their developable land is zoned for multifamily development. Any housing development can result in costs to localities. For example, new development may increase school enrollment, increase traffic, or require extensions of public utilities. Virginia's proffer system provides one way to help offset those costs by allowing developers to voluntarily proffer fees to a locality to offset certain infrastructure costs associated with development. However, proffers can only be offered if a rezoning occurs. Some localities may be discouraged from increasing the amount of land that could be developed for housing by right because doing so would mean foregoing any funds they would receive from developers in the form of proffers. To help offset the costs of additional by right development, the General Assembly could direct DHCD to evaluate how to structure, administer, and fund an incentive program to encourage localities to allow more by right development. Allowing more development and more types of development would reduce costs associated with rezoning for developers and help ensure that a variety of housing types at a variety of price points are available throughout the state. In its research, DHCD should consider options for funding and administering the development, measuring its efficacy, estimating what type and amount of incentive could change local behavior, and determining whether the state could feasibly provide such an incentive. Inclusionary zoning is another way to potentially increase local housing supply. Inclusionary zoning policies either require or allow developers to include a certain number of affordable units in any new development that meets criteria established in the policy. In exchange, developers receive some incentive that either reduces development costs, for example, a waiver from including parking structures, or increases the development's revenue, for example, allowing developers to build more units. Other states and Virginia localities have implemented inclusionary zoning to encourage affordable housing development. All Virginia localities have the authority to implement inclusionary zoning policies, but in most localities, those policies must be voluntary or only required when there is rezoning. This means that in most cases, developers have to volunteer to participate in the program. 7 localities currently have the authority to implement mandatory inclusionary zoning policies, meaning that they can require developers to participate in the program. Research shows that mandatory inclusionary zoning policies are most effective at increasing affordable housing supply. Research also shows that inclusionary zoning policies work best in high-cost, high-growth housing markets where affordability requirements won't discourage housing development. The 7 localities that currently have authority to implement mandatory inclusionary zoning are some of the highest cost and highest growth localities in the state. But other localities have equally high costs and high growth rates. As a reminder, high-cost, high-growth localities were most likely to report zoning as a top barrier to housing development. The General Assembly could consider granting localities with high population growth rates, high home sales prices, and high median rents with the authority to adopt mandatory inclusionary zoning policies. This would allow localities that reported housing constraints to use zoning as a tool to encourage affordable housing rather than to limit it. This change would increase the number of localities with the authority to implement mandatory inclusionary zoning policies from 7 to 20. This number could grow as the localities with high costs and high growth rates change. And finally, this slide summarizes the key findings from our report. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Tracy, do you want to summarize then for the report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, if you could indulge me for just one brief moment. I wanted to make a few remarks about Virginia Housing's REACH program before the agencies speak about our report. As Stephanie said, the REACH program is the state's largest source of discretionary funding for affordable housing and for providing direct financial assistance to homeowners. We do have some recommendations that would actually reduce Virginia Housing's annual net income. Stephanie mentioned those, and therefore the funds that are available to REACH when their net income is reduced. This is a concern that the Secretary and Virginia Housing have raised with us. And we've thought critically about this issue, and we are confident that the impact to REACH of implementing our recommendations will be fairly minimal. For example, our recommendation to improve Virginia Housing's assistance with upfront home ownership costs would reduce contributions to REACH by less than 2% over 10 years. We agree that Virginia Housing must strike a balance between generating income for its operations and its programs and maximizing the impact that its many programs can have on housing affordability. And our recommendations, we believe, would actually be a more direct and effective means of addressing those costs of home ownership. So we just wanted to bring that particular issue to your attention. I know this was a lot to absorb over the past 40 minutes or so from Stephanie. It's quite a complicated area. The team has done a tremendous job of trying to develop very practical and sound recommendations for you all, but I wanted to make sure you understood that we're aware that our recommendations would have that impact on Virginia Housing's net income and REACH, but that we expect the impact to be very minimal.
Questions or comments to Tracy or to Stephanie? Thank you very much for that exhaustive report. I understand Secretary Brian Ball is here, and you would like to address the report. Secretary Ball, the housing offices are under your jurisdiction.
Yes, they are, and thank you very much, Chair Plum, for letting me speak to you all today. I look at this group, and I know my own age, but I've known many of you since you all first showed up in the General Assembly, and it's been a real honor to work with you in a variety of capacities over the years. And the good news here today is you've got two high-performing agencies, and I think JLARC has captured the importance and the value the way these agencies and authority, I should say, in the case of Virginia Housing, perform, and I thank them for that assessment. If you could have watched how these agencies worked during the pandemic, particularly in the rent relief area, and how closely they worked together to get money into the pockets of tenants who couldn't pay and landlords who needed money to keep their properties going, you would have been very proud. I just want to make a couple high-level comments and then turn it over to Susan Dewey and Eric Johnston. The bottom line here is the Housing Trust Fund needs more money. I feel like us in the General Assembly have done a pretty good job over the last few years of getting the appropriation up to a more acceptable level, but that certainly hasn't been our history. DHCD is a top-performing housing agency. They're unparalleled in their grant-making capabilities, and the places in which they operate, you've heard about affordable housing, and translate that, if you want, to workforce housing, which is so critical to economic growth, which is an area we spend a lot of time with, and I think the Chamber has fully recognized that. The permanent supportive housing is something I didn't know too much about until I got into this job, and it's there are many unmet needs there. Homelessness reduction, another area. But to be fully effective, it needs consistent and regular housing trust fund funding from the executive branch and from the General Assembly. Virginia Housing, with whom I also work very closely, is considered by rating agencies such as S&P and Moody's to be a #1 housing finance authority in the country. If you want government to run like a business, which many folks do, this is Exhibit A on how to have government run like a business. Annually, just to give you a few examples, the REACH allocation this past year, $91 million. They've stepped up and done an additional $75 million for Amazon for affordable housing in that region, and we're midstream in the payout of that over a 5-year period. And the important thing is, I think was noted, it doesn't cost the taxpayers a penny. It doesn't cost a penny. This organization doesn't even show up in the Appropriations Act, and it's been that way for many, many years. Now, the flip side of that is they are a business, and so they have to make money to continue to perform the good things that they're doing, to perform the services that they provide. Unlike a bank, and there was reference to them being a financial institution, and I think indeed in many ways they are, but they can't take deposits, and they're not a general fund agency, so they don't take money out of the general fund. So it's very important that they manage their risk so that they stay in business for the indefinite future. Should there be conversations about what a REACH allocation should be or how they do their business? There absolutely should be those conversations, and I think Susan Dewey will tell you, we've had many conversations about that from the time we got into office, and some of them I would characterize as pretty sharp conversations, and so that's healthy, and it's healthy for you all to ask questions too. But I will tell you, prescriptive measures on percentages of income going to programs that they fund, or interest rates or interest rate reductions, I would not recommend them to you at all. This is a financial institution that lends money to be able to do the things that it does, to be able to finance the good things that they do. When either through the executive branch or the legislative branch, that those measures become prescriptive, you're sending a very negative message to the investors in the bonds that they issue, to the underwriters, to the rating agencies, and frankly, there's great potential for increasing their cost of funds, and their ability to continue to do the good may be, it's not going to be eliminated, but it could be compromised to some degree. And so we would encourage these conversations to continue, but would certainly not recommend to you all any sort of prescriptive measures that would affect how they do their business. They have a board. The board spends a lot of time with the management, and Commerce and Trade has historically interfaced with this group extensively. So thank you for letting me make these brief comments, and if there aren't any questions, I'll turn it over to Ms. Dewey.
Susan, come forward. You can expect the continuation of these conversations, I'm sure. While our time is somewhat limited today, if you'll kind of wind up where you are, you can expect the conversation to continue.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Susan, welcome.
Thank you, Secretary Ball, and good morning, Chairman Plum, Vice Chairwoman Howell, and the members of the Commission, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you this morning. I'm Susan Dewey, CEO of Virginia Housing Development Authority, and as you all know, the need for affordable housing has never been greater. There's no easy answer to solve the affordable housing issue, but for nearly 50 years, Virginia Housing has worked diligently to achieve the mission you gave us, to help Virginians attain quality, affordable housing. And we do this, as the Secretary said, with no state taxpayer dollars. We're totally self-funded. We appreciate JLARC's recognition in its report that we are one of the top housing finance agencies in the nation. And we're recognized for our strong public-private partnerships with lenders, realtors, developers, nonprofits, and governments. Working with DHCD, we became the top state in the country for federal rent relief, and now we're implementing federal mortgage relief. At the General Assembly's request, we have implemented a new state rental tax credit, coordinated with partners on a major housing needs assessment that's pursuant to 2020 House Bill 854, which is soon to be released, and work with JLARC on its review of housing. We've been innovating and increasing housing supply, creating a 3D printed home, and encouraging modular housing. And we've shown the vital link between housing and economic development with initiatives like the additional resources we put in from REACH, $75 million from our own funds, to encourage Amazon to come to Virginia. Virginia Housing accomplished all of this while having record lending in both our home ownership and our rental programs and increasing support to the housing delivery network. All of this in the middle of a pandemic. Again, we appreciate JLARC's overall conclusion that we're one of the top HFAs and our programs are effectively meeting our mission. There's several areas that I'd like to mention that are referenced in the report. First, the report does recognize the impact of our Reach Virginia program, and we're very proud of that program. We created it some years ago on our own, and it sets aside a large percentage of net revenues to support critical affordable housing needs. We are actually effectively not at 6%, but when you look at the additional monies that support Amazon, we're at 70% already with that formula. And it supports lower income households, homeless, senior housing, people with disabilities, and revitalization all across the state. As their consultant said, we have used REACH to create an extraordinary set of resources. Over $700 million has gone into this program since inception, over $100 million in each of the last 3 years. Our net assets, net income, and annual affordability, which is the REACH program, are the largest in the entire country. We developed the formula 16 years ago and have steadily increased it over time, and the board looks carefully at this formula every year. So we are happy to work with JLARC to revisit that formula and how we do calculate REACH. And you also heard him talk about our mixed-use, mixed-income program. This was a program that the General Assembly authorized 15 years ago at the request of local governments who really now rely on this program for revitalization. So this program does support a lot of workforce housing, which is also needed across the state. It does allow us to revitalize underserved areas, spur economic development, create workforce housing, and generate income, again, back to the REACH program. So we are happy to look to see if some of the program could also include a rent limit on that program, but it has a lot of important reasons why that program is working so well across the state. And third, on our home ownership program, we think the analysis doesn't fully reflect the fact that our first-time home buyers generally would not qualify for the types of loans that you see in the open market. We use fair, risk-based pricing, and unlike traditional lenders, we offer free down payment grants as well as free home ownership education, and we service all of our own loans, which is very important to keeping people in their homes. These components of the home ownership program have an important purpose: to address the impediments to first-time home ownership, such as lower credit scores, lack of down payment, and to keep them in their homes. That's why our foreclosure rates are so very low. That's the core of our mission. But we are happy to work with JLARC on initiating an independent study to further review our interest rates in conjunction with other incentives. And finally, as JLARC recommends, we will continue to study our program across our business. Each of the recommendations does require substantially more resources, so we have to make sure we're striking that balance between current housing needs and long-term sustainability. And in conclusion, we're proud of the good work that we've done at Virginia Housing and the partnerships. That's how we really accomplish our mission with nonprofits, public and private organizations. And as a top HFA in the country, we've been able to do this for Virginia without state support. Thank you all for your time today, and I do appreciate the hard work of the Commission, its staff, and your interest in support of affordable housing right here in Virginia. And now, for just another minute, we have Eric Johnston, who is the Director of DHCD.
Eric, you can do it in a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Thank you for your leadership on housing and for the professionalism of the staff that work with DHCD on our portion of the study. I also want to thank Secretary Ball and Susan with Virginia Housing Secretary Ball and the Governor for their leadership, and Susan for their strong partnership with us in advancing the supply of affordable housing across the Commonwealth. The one area of the study that focused on DHCD really focused on asking for more research, planning, and analysis to add on to the existing regional, local, and statewide plans and efforts that are undergoing. And we stand ready to work with the JLARC staff and the General Assembly on ideas on the cost estimates and funding that would be needed to undertake the various levels of study, working with both local land use and overall study of affordable housing needs in the Commonwealth. So abbreviate my comments, but mainly to end with House Bill 854 that Susan mentioned comes out with additional options that complement on ways to invest and increase the supply of affordable housing. And we stand ready and look forward to partnering with you all in the months ahead on further look at this study. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Two quick ones, probably to Ms. Sweeney. In the report, there's noted that first off, this is a massive, appreciate the team's work on affordable housing. It's incredibly important to all parts of the Commonwealth. And what was mentioned earlier in the report was that all the low-income housing tax credits were not drawn down. What is the amount and what is sort of inhibiting the process? And I know it's market-driven based on developments and other things, but what are you seeing in factors?
Okay, I think what you're referring to, the low-income housing tax credits are fully allocated. They're always fully used. On the 9% side, that's the most beneficial program. There's also another part of the tax credits, which is called 4%. Now, that comes with a bond allocation to the state based on population. And what was referred to as rental versus home ownership. So what we try to do is to really focus on rental housing and try to use as many of the 4% as we possibly can. But if there are some left over, we want to make sure we don't lose any of that allocation to the state. So that's where we have created this mortgage credit program that helps first-time home buyers.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, one follow-up.
Senator Pike.
Several years ago, I had constituent issues with modular housing, and the state could not help because they did not own the underlying land, which impacted about 50 families. And we're seeing this a lot where we have manufactured homes and there's a lot of pressures on redevelopment, and sometimes those get run down. And then when the infrastructure fails, the people who own this modular housing, they get the boot. And it's very hard, very difficult for 50, sometimes 100 families to deal with it. Have you guys improvised the rules on assisting where they don't own the underlying land, because it impacts a lot of families? Mm-hmm. It was difficult, and you guys couldn't help out because of that condition. We had to work with nonprofit partners and others to figure it out. Even though the state had a ton of money, the rules and regs couldn't help those families.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. And a lot of times now what we're seeing with modular housing is they actually do own the land on that. I think you might be referring more to the manufactured housing, just subtle differences, but a lot of times they're in what people refer to as trailer parks. And we are looking at this area very closely all across the Commonwealth because we agree this is an area. Sometimes they own the lot, sometimes they don't, and then it gets into legal issues that go beyond us. But this is a very important area, and we are trying to see what we can do in this area. We're helping a lot of those parks all across the Commonwealth right now. So I'm happy to get with you if you'd like and talk to you a little bit more about some of our programs for that right now.
Okay, well, obviously we've opened a very important topic, important to so many people in the Commonwealth, and we look forward to conversations and moving forward together on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commission members, we are running a little over time, but if you'll stick with us, we got a couple items we need to take up. We'll first call on Delegate Sickles to give a report on the study topic selection subcommittee. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate that. In your packet, you'll have the four studies. Thanks for helping me out here, Jason. Do you want to say something before I start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to help you. To your point, there's 4 study resolutions in your packet, just to orient everybody, if I might, Mr. Chairman. There are 2 that were kind of the consensus of the study subcommittee, which met after the last JLARC meeting, and that was a pretty comprehensive review of the community service boards, as well as a review of higher education financial aid processes. There was one that was a little bit lower tier based on the subcommittee's discussion, and that was a review of Go Virginia. And then there was kind of late-breaking interest among some members, I believe, of the Senate in kind of a review of the different agencies that the state has in place to kind of oversee gaming and horse racing, and maybe some focus on kind of consolidating some of that. So those were the four. And just to remind everybody, our staff has capacity to do 2 studies. And the ones that were kind of first on the study subcommittee are the CSBs and the higher ed, but it is up to you. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Chairman Sickles. But
That's a good, I reread all these resolutions last night and, really want to do all of it because it's all needed. But unfortunately, folks, we're going to have to pick 2 of these. And to me, the CSB situation and trying to get our mental health reform accessible to all Virginians and looking at delivery systems to do that is very important. So that personally is my top priority. The other, the effectiveness of the Go Virginia program, it's important for someone to stay on top of that, or us to stay on top of that with time. The gaming situation, we've got these 3 agencies out there, and there have been, and especially in the charitable gaming, lots of controversy in that sector recently. So personally, I would want to ask the Commission's viewpoints on the other 3. And not that we're saying the CSB is a done deal, but I can see benefit to any of the other 3. Higher ed is probably something that we need to do with rising costs and the balance that we've tried to strike between having our in-state students have to borrow less, which has kind of been a position that some of us have taken over time, and borrow, because we're going to pay up front for our education, so our students won't have to borrow as much money in the future. But just making sure we have a rational system, I think it'd be good to do that.
Mr. Chairman?
And I would, is me, Mr. Chairman? Or
Yes.
Mr.
You, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Chairman Sickles.
Little Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Madam Speaker.
I know we're running out of time, and I know we've spent a lot of time discussing these resolutions and these ideas. I feel strongly, as I stated at the last meeting, that we need to move forward on the CSBs and the higher ed. I mean, it's been, Virginia, I believe, the Commonwealth has not reviewed the financial aid in close to 4 or 5 years.
It's been about 7 or 8 years, yes.
7 or 8 years. So therefore, I strongly support moving forward with, you mentioned we could do 2, with the CSBs and the higher ed. Thank you.
Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Senator McPike.
So, yeah, I certainly support the CSB and the mental health. I think that's a pretty consistent theme across. I think that the higher ed, we do have some studies and information and other interim reports that have provided, but the gaming space right now and the lack of enforcement and the need for consolidation amongst agencies has been urgent for years. And this is something that is going to be pressing. The longer we wait on this, it's only going to get worse. And, there were some, early recommendations in the casino, but it really takes, I think, the prowess of JLARC and the team to take a look at how to do the restructuring. If we wait on this, we're going to dig ourselves a bigger hole because we're not going to be able to transform the number of different entities. The things that are going on and reported through the subcommittee and charitable have been significant in their work, and we need the expertise to help structure an agency and guidance, which is why I asked Mr. Chairman that this also be included. That was before the court decision last week. That was 2 weeks prior to the court decision. And now we have a court decision that's also throwing everything back up in the air, that we're not getting tax revenue. We're not getting all these other things that we should have. So I think it's multifaceted that we need to tackle here.
Okay, is there any further comment? And
Yes,
yep.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Howe.
I'd like to agree with Senator McPike on this. The court decision really has just turned everything into turmoil, and we need to get a handle on how best to regulate all of our gaming. And it's going to come quickly, but I think we could delay if we had a study that we could rely on, and rather than just stumble into this whole issue again.
Okay, is there, maybe the way to move forward, Mr. Chairman, would he have a motion that if anyone, without objection, that we approve the CSB study? Would be objection to that?
No objection. Let's do that
No
now.
objection, so, okay, that's one. And we've got two that's been discussed here. For the second one, does anyone want to have anything further to say on the gaming study or the higher ed
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I understand the
Madam
gaming
Chair.
issue, and it's no disrespect, but I'm just going to say the way I feel. I feel that it's more meaningful to go with the financial aid in higher education for Virginians and for students who are facing debt, in their education and families who are planning. And so I agree with the speaker that the financial aid is, to me, takes more precedence than the gaming.
Okay, it looks like we might have to have a vote here, some motion, one way or the other. Mr. Chairman, Dorian.
Thank you, sir. I want some clarification. What are you guys asking us to do?
Approve the major studies for the coming year. The staff is available to do 2 major studies, and they do them at our direction.
Okay.
The question is, what do we direct them to do?
So we have 4 studies here. You want us to approve 2?
Yep, and we've just approved one.
I already did CSB.
Which one did we approve?
The one,
CSBs.
effectiveness of Virginia's community services boards in your packet. We have 4 in your packet.
Correct. I know that. I see that. I'm just, seems like we're all over the place trying to discuss these things. And if you want us to vote on them individually, then I think that's the best way to go, to be on record with that.
Does
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Delegate Cox, did you, or was
I'm
that?
as, if I could, I'm as sensitive to y'all's work schedule as anyone, but you really do seem to have a dilemma here. I guess my question is, bandwidth capacity, no way we could do the 3. Hate to put you on the spot, but I'm leaving, so I can.
Go ahead.
We've looked at that, Cox, and I think, given the other studies that we're required to do by resolution, we really only have the bandwidth and staff to do 2 of these 3.
That's the answer I was looking for.
There are 3 pretty substantial ones in the queue already through joint resolution from last session. So.
Appreciate the honesty.
So we've heard discussion on 2 of them, but we don't know how, the committee, I guess we should, Chairman Plum.
As you know, the process is that we have a subcommittee to look at these, and the subcommittee looked at maybe a dozen, looked at a whole bunch more than this, came forth with 2.
Correct.
That's the CSBs and the higher ed.
Correct.
That is not to say that's the end of studies for this coming year. The way this process goes, these are major studies that this staff, JLARC staff, will undertake. However, as you know, during the course of the legislative process, there will be other resolutions introduced, and other studies will be conducted in the other formats. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't address the issue of gaming. The issue is right now today, how do we have focus what the staff is? And I hope we'll go with the recommendations of the study of the subcommittee.
Okay, Senator Howe?
I just wanted to make sure that we remembered that it's not a majority of the people here, it's the majority of each house.
Okay, thank you. So do we need a motion? Does anybody want to speak to this? We've lost several members here. Anybody want to speak to I have 3 remaining, right? But 1 was recommended by the subcommittee. That's where we are. Does somebody want to make a motion? And then we're going to take a roll call, and we have to have a majority vote.
I can do a roll call if you need me to do that. So.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Delegate Cox.
Delegate Sickles, did y'all make the recommendation of the top 2? If you did, you should make that. Maybe it'd be best if you made that recommendation.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Okay, I will move that the subcommittee's recommendation that we study community services boards and the higher education student financial and awards policies and processes as our 2 studies.
So, Mr. Chairman, point of order. Just the first part has already been adopted, and so it really is the remaining balance that would be on the table Would that be correct?
No, that's true, that's true.
Mr. Chairman, do we actually take a vote on that first, the CSB study? Maybe I missed that.
Well, we didn't take a vote, we did it by acclamation.
Okay, so you can do, okay.
We did by, so the senator is correct, so we really don't need to do that one. So
Mr. Chairman,
my motion would be just that we approve the higher education financial aid package. Delegate Cox, speaking to the motion? Yeah,
I
we
would
need a
say
second.
maybe to be more consistent, it might be better if we withdrew the first one. That way you get the true recommendation of the subcommittee.
Okay.
And then you wouldn't need a second because it's a recommendation of a standing committee or a subcommittee.
Okay, well, I guess I made that motion earlier, so I will withdraw it. It was a without objection motion, but that is now hereby withdrawn, and I'll go back to my original motion, which hasn't received a second yet.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. There's discussion, I'm sure, on this motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure why we're going backwards. I think we're unified with the CSB, and by now bringing them back to a whole recommendation, we're starting to split our sort of work and thoughts on it. I think we can well express, and I think some of that expression has happened this morning fairly clearly. And so, you know, I would still prefer, we have a lot of unknowns within the gaming sector that generates money for education, by the way, that is unregulated. There are a lot of missing components right now, and we need to get a handle on it. This is urgent and emergent, so.
Point of order,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Delegate Hearing.
Am I correct that there is a pending motion on the table? There was a motion and a second.
Yeah, there was, and I think the senator was speaking to the motion. Weren't you? Were you speaking to the motion? Okay. Is there anyone else that wants to speak?
Just making sure.
Anyone else want to speak to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Torian.
I think that there, as I hear it, there perhaps may be some unreadiness among the committee members as to voting these two recommendations in block.
So are you going to, do you have a motion to sever?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, if the motion fails, you're going to end up with, the next motion is going to be the other two anyway. I mean, you're going to put the other motion, so we're just, I don't care. It's just mental gymnastics at this point. So,
Right.
But if you vote this down, obviously, you're going to make the motion include gaming study, and so.
Thank you for that clarification. Yep, so if this motion fails, we're back to zero, and it will fail if we don't have, how many senators? You would have to have 2 of the 3 senators. Am I correct on that, Mr. Brown? We have 3 senators
let's see,
here.
I'm trying to look who we have lost a couple of senators.
We have 3. No,
Norman,
2.
is Senator Norman on?
We have 3.
With us? I don't believe he is. So yeah, we've got 3 senators.
So we need 2 senators to vote for this resolution, and I think we're ready to vote. Yeah, we need 2 of the 3. The majority of the Senate present is, right? Okay, so does someone want to take the roll call vote?
I can do it, and I'll just go in alphabetical order. So just to, can you clarify one more time the motion on the table that everyone's voting for?
The motion on the table is to accept the subcommittee recommendation for the 2 studies.
Okay. Let's see, Delegate Austin is not here. Delegate Cox.
Aye.
Speaker Filler-Corn. Aye. Delegate Herring.
Aye.
Let's see, Senator Howell. No. Senator Locke, still here. Senator McPike. No. Let's see, Delegate Auroch has left.
Motion fails.
You got Delegate
Motion fails, you know. There's no need to
Can I vote?
Yeah, Delegate Torian.
Well, the two
Can I vote?
Yeah, I still have more to read, but
the 2 of the 3 senators voted no, so.
Can we still vote?
Okay. All right. I'm trying to get people out of here.
Aye.
Delegate Plum, okay. Let's see, Delegate Sickles.
Aye.
And Delegate Torian. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
And
Oh, I'm sorry, Carr, yes. What would you vote? I'm sorry. Delegate Carr, aye. Okay. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 2 nays, and the rest ayes.
The motion fails. Based on our rules.
The
Is
two
that-
two senators voted no
Okay.
of the three.
Okay.
Okay, so we need does anybody want to offer another motion? I can move the CSB motion now, and maybe we could do that by voice vote?
Yep.
Okay, all in favor of the CSB study, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, did that. Chair's accepting motions on the, we've got 3 studies left before us: gaming, financial aid, and Virginia Go Virginia, I mean. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd move the adoption of the gaming resolution.
Is there a second? Second. Okay, it's been moved and seconded that the gaming resolution be approved.
Mr. Chair.
Discussion on the motion,
Yeah,
Delegate Herring?
just speaking to the motion, and
Yes.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that the lawsuit that is being referred to is the one that we've been reading in the press, that it was a decision by the court on First Amendment grounds involving grade machines. Is that what you're talking about? I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Senator Pike.
I think there are multiple components. That is one component. There's the charitable subcommittee led by Delegate Krizik this year that has a number of recommendations, one of which is to this end, that JLARC study to look at the structure. There's been a number of reports that there's no enforcement because enforcement is spread across multiple agencies and they're not funded. And so it's allowing these sort of entities to persist at the expense of also those who are doing the right thing and doing things legally. And so there's many different facets. Many communities are also starting up casinos and breaking ground on those investments. And yet there's folks that are undermining those efforts within the marketplace. If that answers your question, Delegate. Sorry, it's sort of, it's multifaceted is my point.
Delegate Herring.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I was just asking for clarification on the issue of that pending lawsuit, because it seemed to weigh heavily, and I would just say that, I mean, that's a different, again, we all know separation of powers, that we still have authority to act, and I get that there are members of this committee that want this studied, Mr. Chair, but what I would say is that, again, I support, the issue with the student finances and the financial aid, and my concern is that we just had a discussion about the bandwidth of JLARC, and if we vote, if anyone's so inclined to vote for the motion, what position does that put our JLARC staff in deciding and making priorities of what to study? That's just a valid and real concern. And then we're about to go into session. The staff going to have to choose, and I feel like we're muddying the waters here. I mean, we as a legislature can continue to act with authority that we have in passing laws. The injunction, whatever JLARC does, is not going to impact the injunction. This is a court case. So those are two separate things, and I don't think it should be used to rationalize. That's just me, a reason that we should have this study. So I feel like there's a lot of moving parts. I'm not sure the answer is going to be have this JLARC study.
Okay, looking for ways forward here, unless we can get the 3 senators two of them to agree, we're not gonna, maybe we just have to punt this until our next meeting or something, and we'll have, we'll have 3. I think that, can Mr. Greer speak first, or you want to speak right now, or let him say something?
Go
Senator
ahead.
Howe.
Well,
Senator Howe.
Okay. I was going to suggest that we postpone this vote until the first week of the session or sometime in that time frame, because I do think that there are ways we could work out a study that I think the senators would agree to. But at this point, it's really, I think, essential that we do a study like this. And the higher ed is that we already know there's other things that can be done on higher ed through SHEV and everything, but I'd like some kind of assurance that this issue can be looked at impartially, and that's the purpose of the JLARC.
Did you?
So,
Okay.
I think maybe the director wanted to.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just speak briefly to this, I guess from a staff standpoint, we need to really get direction from you. And so I think it would be optimal to get 2 studies for us to move out on since we've got the capacity to do next year. My concern is if we don't reach a decision on that second study today, whether we get in the session and then we don't get direction on a second study for next year, obviously would not be ideal. And I guess my concern with waiting to the first week of the session is the House membership is going to change, and we won't even know who is on JLARC necessarily, which may complicate doing it then. So I'm just trying to figure out how this would work out.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Phil Coyne.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
I believe if we do this the first week in January, nothing has changed. So if you're talking about prior to, the 12th, and the
Before the
commission
session.
stay the same.
We could certainly do it that way. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I move that we delay the decision till prior to January 12th, to a meeting prior to January 12th.
Okay, is there a second to the, okay, it's been moved and seconded that we delay decision to prior to January 12th, before session starts.
Question.
Delegate Torian.
So we're directing JLARC to move forward with the first study.
Community
Yes,
service
sir.
boards, correct.
And then we're going to vote to address the direction on a second study from your report.
From one of these remaining
The
3.
remaining 3.
Yes,
So
sir.
they're going to move,
No.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
So they're going to
Mr.
move,
Chair. Okay.
they're going to move forward with the first study that we just voted on.
Yes, sir.
That one is a go.
Yes, sir.
And then we'll make a determination the first week in January as to the direction on what the second study will be.
Which would, but due to the discussion here, that would not include Go Virginia, probably include the higher ed or the gaming oversight.
So,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, and thank
yeah.
you for that but I thought, and I was not imagining it, I thought that we just approved right after the higher educational line, right after.
No.
No,
We didn't?
no. The
was voted
majority,
down?
the majority,
Got voted down. We did not have
Oh,
majority.
that's
Senate
right,
vote.
thank you, thank you.
yeah.
Everybody
Okay.
clear? Everybody clear on our direction?
Call for,
Yeah.
call for the question.
Yep. All in favor of delaying until before January 12th, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Mr. Chairman, the subcommittee report is completed.
Thank you, Mr.
One
Chairman.
last agenda item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you wonder why it is we don't resolve all these other issues that we have for us on JLARC recommendations, anybody want to make a motion on the juvenile justice system or affordable housing and see if we couldn't knock it off this afternoon? I'm just kidding. It just gives you some emphasis of how important we consider the work you do. That's why it takes so hard time to figure it out. All right, just stick with us a couple of minutes. We just got a couple items that are very quick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we're down to our last item, and I'll ask Jamie Best to stand up and give you the 1-minute version of our VRS report. We do have Trish Bishop and Ron Schmitz from VRS here if you have a specific question for them. But Jamie, if you could just briefly give a report to the members.
Okay. VRS update. This is our regular update that we do periodically. Jamie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time and the many grumbling stomachs in the room, I will give you the very short version. If we skip ahead to slide 4, the VRS trust funds investments achieved a 24.3% return for the 1-year period ending on September 30th. At that time, the fund held nearly $104 billion in assets, and that is an increase of $18.6 billion over the last year. It also marks the first time that the fund has exceeded the $100 billion level. And I should also say that the total fund also achieved positive returns over all of its benchmark periods. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to skip ahead to slide 8. Here you can see on this slide that the contribution rates for the upcoming biennium for the teachers and state employees plans. These are the board certified rates, contribution rates. They are slated to decrease, and so the decreases are mainly due to the large investment returns that the fund has achieved in the past fiscal year, and those were enough to offset increases in liability associated with changes in the mortality assumptions that were made. Again, in the interest of time, I will skip ahead to slide 10. The funded status of both the teachers and state employees plans increased in FY21. Both are now funded at 77%. And the green bars over on the right show you the projected funded status over the next 5 years. And they are projected to increase over that period. I do want to caution you that they are just projections and they depend on a number of assumptions, and in particular that the plan and the trust fund continues to meet its 6.75% assumed rate of return. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, the General Assembly has taken several steps in recent years to reduce the unfunded liabilities and long-term costs of the VRS plans, and there are at least 3 types of options for additional steps in the future. First, the state could maintain the current higher contribution rates rather than reducing them for the upcoming biennium. That option, for example, with the teacher's plan, could reduce unfunded liabilities for that plan by as much as $380 million. Second, the state could change how it's repaying unfunded liabilities for the plans, either by shortening the repayment period or by essentially paying higher amounts earlier rather than later. And shortening, for example, the repayment period from 20 to 22 years could mean more than $900 million in interest savings over that period. And then finally, the state could make additional one-time cash infusions to the plans, like the $61 million that was provided to the teacher's plan last fiscal year to finish paying off deferred contributions. Mr. Chairman, that is an extremely brief summary of our update on VRS. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions there may be.
Any questions? Be assured that members of the staff of the Finance and Appropriations Committee are here, and they've duly noted, no doubt, your potential recommendations, and that would be the appropriate place to take those up. So thank you for bringing those forward to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hal, you have one quick item.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that concludes our agenda. I did want to mention that in your packet is an update from VEC on implementation of JLARC recommendations that you requested from them last month, so you should find that there. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank all the members for your support of the work of the Commission this year, and I especially want to thank you for your 2 years of service as the chairman of this Commission. We truly appreciate your leadership over these 2 years and your tremendous support for staff over these 2 years. Really do appreciate it.
I'm not going anyplace.
As chairman, in your role as chairman, we're saying.
Thank you very much.
Hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.
You too. Thank you so much. Well, that concludes our meeting. This meeting will stand adjourned.